Hello everyone, thank you for joining us. We're here for this session that we call Investing in Climate Action, and it's a pleasure to have you with us for one of the issues that we consider to be one of the most important things that we can be discussing those days. My name is Spyros Kouvelis. I'm an advisor to the United Nations Environment Programme and at the same time directing the joint center between the University of Cambridge and the European Public Law Organization on governance for the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. We have with us a wonderful array of people, besides all of you, up here on the panel. We have 5 speakers that I will just introduce by name and the institution they are in. The rest you can find in your applications, and I would strongly suggest that you pick up discussions with them afterwards. So we have on the far right, Julia Bucknall from World Bank. On my right, Saadia Madsbjerg. Sorry for that. It's from the Rockefeller Foundation. On my immediate left, Vijay, now if you thought the previous name was difficult, Vijay Manthripragada.
Oh, you got it.
Yay! From Montrose Environmental. Then Nelson Switzer from Nestlé Waters. And at the far left, Gary White from WaterEquity. So thank you all for being with us today. Just in the sense of a very quick introduction, I will be giving one opening question to each of the speakers. They will respond to that, but then I am hoping that we will engage in a discussion between us. Keep in mind that if you have a burning point to make or a question while the discussion is happening, please put up your hand and I will make sure that the microphone reaches you so that you can put up the discussion. But anyway, at the closing 10 minutes of our session, I will be opening the floor for Q&A. So if you have points that you will want to do and it's not burning for the right moment that somebody is speaking, then you'll be able to do at the end. Our point is about investing in climate action. It's not just about climate change, because we think that climate change is a very important thing, and it has to be addressed by both addressing the need to mitigate what is happening, but also to adapt in the change that is happening. And my personal view is that we need to relate that to all the different aspects of human life and human economy as well, in the way that humanity is and will be facing challenges in the future, like water shortages, health issues, food production and food availability for people, employment, the oceans. And in that sense, I think that relating it to all these 17 Sustainable Development Goals that have been approved by all the UN countries in 2015 is a very important thing, because my personal conviction is that unless we try to bind, if you like, climate change to all the different challenges and all the different aspects of human life, things will not happen as fast as they should. Second thing is that unless we manage to bring together the business development and investment to climate change in new technologies, in things that need to be done, it will remain a discussion that is based on principles, which is great and very important, but we need to make things happen. And to make things happen, investment is a very, very important thing. And finally, I think that in order to make this investment happen, I think that we need to lay the ground for inspiration for business development and so on. So with this introduction, I would like to invite our speakers to take the floor and say a few things on that, and I will start by Julia. Julia, in a pre-session call that we had, you spoke about good investment. I liked very much the term good investment. We'll speak about sustainable investment in a while, but I think good investment is a very interesting way to approach things. And then you were also speaking about the role of the public sectors in intervening in the risk reduction for investment. So if you would like to start with that, sure, and then expand it any way you like.
Thank you. Thanks everybody, and it's lovely to be here. So the World Bank is about poverty. Literally written on our front door is "Our dream is a world free of poverty" in stone, literally written in stone. And around 2010, it became apparent to us that the historic gains in poverty reduction that the world has seen in the last 30, 40 years, which are truly extraordinary, are at risk of being undermined by climate change. And so the World Bank literally trained all of its managers in climate change. So everybody who works on health, education, macroeconomics, banking, all got trained in climate. They went to Cambridge, actually.
All right.
And so we've been trying to really make sure that climate change is embedded in all of our investments, because we see this risk of undermining the basic human prosperity that has been so beneficial in the last few decades. And we have a commitment to make 28% of our total investment having climate co-benefits by 2020, and we're almost there. We're at 26% now. So that means it's about $15 billion a year that goes into climate change, both adaptation and mitigation, and that makes us one of the largest financiers of climate action worldwide. Now, the World Bank part, which is where I work, is a purely public finance organization. We lend money to governments. That's all we do. We have another branch that does insurance, and we have another branch that does lots of investments in the private sector, and they were always a little bit separate. And so what we've done in the last couple of years is look at how, recognizing that the public sector alone hasn't got enough money to make all the investments that are needed, but the public sector can't invest without, sorry, the private sector can't invest without the public sector doing its bit and without some risk mitigation measures, because it's just too risky to do some of these things. So the idea is that there are very many potential climate investments out there in lots of different countries with very high returns, potentially. But those very high returns are even riskier. And so our goal now is to make sure that we spend public money only on things that only the public sector can do. It sounds really obvious, and we've always sort of done that, but to try and do that, to try and bring in private investment. And to do that both by making the public sector space work properly and by bringing down the risk explicitly in private investment. And so we're seeing those sorts of things happening in all kinds of spaces. And the ones, I'm the director for environment, so I work on natural resources. So I work mainly on the kind of forests, landscapes, coastal zones areas mostly. And so we're seeing those kinds of investments happening all over the place, and investing in the landscape in order to protect the physical investment that you're building for some other reason. So a road or a hydropower dam. If you invest in the landscape upstream, you're going to make your road more sustainable. You're going to make your dam not fill up with sediment so quickly, and that gives you a lot of adaptation benefits, right? And so it's actually giving a lot of impetus to public sector type investments in things that were always done for niche reasons before, but now are being done as kind of mainstream reasons, and that we're starting to see changing people's understanding of why they should act the way they do.
That's very interesting, Julia, and I think that what you, I mean, I'm keeping what you say about the risk mitigation and the role of the public sector in that, because unless we, as we said before, put the conditions there on the field for private investment to come in, we will not be able to reach out to all the capital that is needed. And that brings me to you, Saadia. We need to engage the capital markets as a whole construct. Would you like to expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, so I think what Julia was saying sets it up perfectly. You know, World Bank is one of the biggest financiers in the area, but if we look at how much money is actually needed, and one of the numbers that was put out there is $12.7 trillion between now and 2030 to achieve the goals that were laid out in the Paris Climate Agreement. That 12.7 trillion is not going to come from the multilateral development banks or the development finance institutions or the philanthropies of the world. It needs to come from the capital markets. Now, we also have a challenge that our market systems, as they've existed for a very long time, were built without having an insight into what climate risk is and what its implications are on the global economy. I think 2017 was a really interesting year because there are a number of things that happened within that financial system that begins to signal that the private sector is moving and the private investors are moving. I think you have a lot of the big investors, the likes of BlackRock and Vanguard, that went out there and said to the corporations that you need to have a better understanding of what risks you're facing as a company because of climate. And that may be related to your access to the raw materials that you need to do. It may be that you are operating in markets that are extremely vulnerable to natural disasters. So there's a shift that happened there. I think you have the rating agencies that also stood up. Moody's put out the letter towards the end of 2017 that basically said that for municipalities that have not built climate adaptation and climate mitigation strategies into the way they operate, they may face a negative credit rating, or pressure at least. And then you have the insurance companies as well. I mean, if we just look towards last year, now we're sitting in California, the massive economic cost from the wildfires here in California was unprecedented. And it keeps going higher and higher and higher. The estimate for last year here in Northern California was $9 billion. You look at one of the other big events that happens, which was the hurricanes in the Atlantic with Harvey, Irma, and Maria, that's close to $100 billion. So you also have the insurance industry that's been in the business of understanding and pricing risk for a very long time, saying, you know what, the levels that we're at, the way we operate is not what's going to get us, you know, to where we need to be. And then lastly, also because we have Nestlé here on the panel, I'd say, you know, from the corporate side also, there's been a real kind of standing up and saying, what do we do? What do we do if our supply chains are at risk because places we source from now are at risk of running out of water? What do we do if, you know, places that we get some of our raw materials from, the land there is getting completely degraded, so you can no longer produce what you used to be able to. So I think there's all these positive indications that has happened in the private markets that gives hope. Now, also to add a but to all of this momentum is that it's still not quite obvious what the products are, the financial products, whether it's on the investment side or the insurance side, that's really going to bring in the money that you can count in the trillions. Like, we all love to talk about green bonds, and you know they do deserve a lot of credit at, you know, when you look at the scale of where they've gotten to, over 100 billion in issuance now projected. But if you put that again in comparison to 12.7 trillion, you quickly realize that that is not the solution. It's one of them. So what we do at the Rockefeller Foundation, working with almost all of the industries that are represented or sectors represented here, is to say, what is that next generation of products and mechanisms that can allow investors to invest and make a difference when it comes to climate? And that is everything from how you protect coastal communities with products like reef insurance. It is around creating new equity funds that can invest in rehabilitating degraded lands. It's working with municipalities to say, how do you introduce pay-for-performance components that allow them to invest in green infrastructure, and a number of other things. And that's where we think a lot more needs to happen if we really want to make a difference.
Thank you, Saadia. I find this very interesting because we will be coming back to the issue of sustainable finance and sustainable investment. As you said, we can see that there is a growing wave for this, but we need to find practical, down-to-earth ways that it's measurable, that it is traceable, that even the owners of funds can be secured about really the sustainability of what they're doing. So I will be coming back to this question because there are practical issues at place, including the European Commission itself that had a meeting in March, I'm sure you will know, with heads of states. Emmanuel Macron was there and Juncker was there, about how Europe can turn towards sustainable finance and sustainable investment. But before we come to engaging the capitals in sustainable finance, I would like to turn to you, Vijay, because I think that you come from a different perspective where by providing environmental services, you actually build business on the lack of knowledge and the risk that there is out there for environmental issues, but more importantly, related to climate change as a whole. And I think that all this change creates opportunities for business, but you are the one who made it through your startup company. And I would like to focus a little bit and let our audience here understand how all this setup creates business and can attract funding and investment.
Thank you, Spyros. Thank you to the Milken Institute. And thanks to all of you for being here. It's a bit tough to compete with Tom and Giselle, as I was just reminded. But hopefully we'll make it worth your while. You know, just before I begin, just a real quick show of hands. How many of you try to buy organic foods or try to look at the ingredients in the groceries that you buy to try and minimize your intake of synthetic chemicals, right? Most of you.
I'd like a picture of that.
Yeah, don't be shy. I've seen you at Whole Foods. You know, similar question along the same vein. How many of you can articulate what's in the air that you put in your lungs 23 to 24,000 times a day? right?
Everybody stopped breathing for a reason.
Or in the water that's here in the hotel that you're drinking. You know, along a similar vein, many of you are owners or investors in businesses, and I think you can pretty quickly articulate what the earnings and cash flow profile is of the businesses that you invest in, and who the auditors are, right? That validate a lot of the data and inputs that you get. But how many of you similarly can articulate succinctly what the environmental footprint or profile is of the businesses that you invest in? Or, right, in the same vein, who's auditing the businesses that you own or invest in to ensure that they're complying with environmental regulations, right? And this is precisely the issue, right? This is, and I say this not as a criticism, but because this is the opportunity that we get excited about, and it's the thesis that basically underlies what drives Montrose Environmental, the company I work for. You know, as Spyros kind of mentioned in his opening, I don't love the word startup, but we're a 5-year-old business that started here in California not too long ago, particularly compared to many of my colleagues here on the panel. But today, we're about 1,200 people in 50-some-odd offices across the United States. We've got investments and projects all around the world. So we see a tremendous opportunity in this industry that we call the environmental industry. But we perhaps have the unique perspective of being a very young company that's trying to navigate, right, in a for-profit way, that's trying to navigate this broad space that we call the environmental services. And I think, you know, along with the opportunities and challenges that it brings, and I think we have this relatively unique perspective that I'd love to share with you, and just to be a little provocative, maybe share some perspectives that may be a little different as a result of the type of entity that we are and how we've grown up in this space. I think the first is that I'm not so sure I love the panel topic, right, or the panel title. Not to suggest it's not important. Look, the work we do day to day is absolutely geared towards helping to mitigate the impact of climate change. But think about those words, investing in climate change, right? It's a little clunky, and it's not all that clear as we think about the broad impact that a lot of these activities have. You know, I think when I talk to my colleagues and my employees, the way we frame it at Montrose is we think about the air, water, and soil being inextricably linked, along with the flora and the fauna and all of you and the humans around the world that are deeply interconnected. And the reason I say that way is because we think of it as an incredibly complex biosphere. And as we try to think about how our daily lives, our day-to-day activities impact that biosphere, it's incredibly complex. And the climate is one part of that, but it's not all of it. And so I think that a better way to perhaps frame some of these discussions is the business case for helping people help the environment, right? We all lead day-to-day lives that we should continue to lead the way we do, obviously making some changes that are practical and prudent. We certainly want to improve the lives of many that perhaps don't enjoy the same benefits that we do. But we have to do that in a way that I think we all agree will help the health of the biosphere, the health of the environment. And so I think it's important to frame the conversation properly, because it's not until we frame it properly that we can ask the right questions and come up with the right solution. So that I think is kind of one thought I would leave out there. I think the second is that as you kind of read the panel summary, we talk about how the interests are all broadly aligned, right? I'm not so sure that's true. And we certainly live that day to day. I keep hitting the microphone, sorry. And so what I mean by that, kind of two small examples, right? So if you think about the regulatory landscape here in the United States, it's a mess, right? You have the state regulations, you have the local regulations, you have the federal regulations. On top of all of that, you've got swipe of pen risk, which makes it very tough for a business that's oriented towards the environmental space to make decisions about short-term and long-term. And so this is a real challenge for us day to day. And look, we're frankly succeeding. As I mentioned, we're doubling kind of every 2 years. We're succeeding despite the lack of alignment, not because of the alignment. Similarly, and I think this is a challenge to all of you, many of whom are leaders in the global capital markets. The capital markets are perhaps one of the most powerful forces, right, in the world today. It's not clear to me as a young business operating in this space that we're all, or all of you, are fully aligned, right? If you think about the questions you ask, the data you mandate from the companies in which you invest, or even the demands you make of the companies in which you invest as it relates to environmental stewardship, it's not consistent and it's not clear. And so I think there's a real opportunity here to simplify the regulatory landscape, to align the capital markets, because when that happens, there can be more companies like Montrose that really start to blossom and solve a lot of these problems. You'll unleash the beauty of innovation and entrepreneurship and startups. So I would encourage all of you to think about that. I mean, look, we're still incredibly optimistic. There's clearly an increase in political will, as we saw with Macron and the One Planet Summit recently, back in December of last year. We're incredibly optimistic about the future. We're growing rapidly and we're bullish in the space. But there's a lot to be done, and I think we have to be sober about how we think about the risks and the opportunities and what it's like for a business to operate in this space. It's only going to get better, and I'm excited to kind of have a debate with you about that, to think about how we can grow this together. So thank you.
Thank you, Vijay. Thank you so much. Yep. We will be coming back to this issue of regulation, how we need to simplify it and make it all actually speak in the language of business. Otherwise, it's becoming an impediment on having business developed around addressing climate change. We could maybe change the term of climate change to global warming, but not in this room because everybody's freezing. And now, having called your company of 1,200 people and how many offices around the world a startup, I'm not sure I could use the same term for Nestlé waters, but I'd like to ask Nelson to tell us a little bit of his point of view about how investment can be part of the adaptation process and how you see things from your very vast experience on issues.
My vast experience. I'm going to tell my mother you said I have vast experience in something. She'll be so proud.
Mothers like that.
Well, thank you first of all for having me here and for inviting Nestlé and Nestlé Waters to be a part of this. This is a terrific opportunity and honor. So thank you. It's tough to follow some of these comments already, and as I was sitting here, I was rethinking so many of the things I've already thought I was going to share. But I think there's two. First, I think it's important that we remember what climate is, and I know the jokes all jokes notwithstanding about global warming and so on. But climate and climate change is about volatility. It's about the inability to predict where water is going to be, what the weather is going to be like at any particular time. This, for a business like Nestlé, as Julia pointed out, is a great challenge for us, right? Or I'm sorry, maybe it was Saadia who pointed it out. Where can we source the materials that we need in order to supply our customers and consumers? How do we know what's going to be available when and where? This is a major challenge for organizations, especially when you become as diversified and as large as Nestlé, where you have very complicated, very distributed networks of supply. So understanding that is incredibly important and something we talk about pretty often, which is about predictability. And it's not just about drought, it's about flood as well. And those are two important pieces to remember. But there's also something I wanted to pull out about this is when people talk about climate, especially climate investment, there are these two persistent false narratives that have been around forever. As a matter of fact, I sat on a panel that had a very similar topic about 15 or more years ago, where it was really talking about, and it was very dire, like the world is essentially coming to an end. And it was quite sad to sit on that panel. As a matter of fact, one of the people on that panel asked the question on the panel, is it too late? And I was just shocked by the question, because me, I'm an optimist, and I think, like you, Vijay, I'm an optimist, and I thought, of course it's not too late. There's something that we can do. But I realized later, thinking about it, what the false narrative was. And it's two pieces. The first is that you have to make a choice. You have to make a choice either between climate adaptation and climate mitigation or climate mitigation. The second is that we have to suffer. That if we're going to make those investments in order to either adapt and or mitigate, we have to suffer. So I remember the head of British Gas in the UK was fired, or at least nearly fired, for stating that in order to save greenhouse gases, let's make it a little bit warmer in our flat in the summer and a little cooler in our flat in the winter. So you wear a jumper in the winter. And people went nuts over that because it was this notion that suddenly they had to suffer for this notion of sustainability. And I quite frankly see that as a false narrative. We absolutely should not. I think it takes away from our human condition this compulsion that we have as a society to move forward, to develop, to live better than the generation before. And so I think that those are incredibly important narratives that now as I sit on this panel, and we were talking about it before we even sat down, it's a very different type of discussion. It's a much more hopeful discussion now because we recognize that you do not have to make a choice that says, I will suffer for sustainability. But Julia, you brought it up in one of your first lines, and I loved so much progress has been made to alleviate poverty. But if we do not invest appropriately when it comes to climate change, that may be its undoing. Mm-hmm. And so there's two pieces, and maybe this will go a little bit more to the philosophical. But I think we have to think about, first of all, not just where we spend money, but where we are going to stop spending money. And I'm not talking about the divestiture movement. I'm talking about true asset mix. I am a huge believer in the power of the capital markets, and I have become a bigger believer in the capital markets as I've been working in it now for about 20 years, seeing how our society has evolved. Our society has evolved because essentially when things began for humanity, it was two big aspects or institutions that helped ensure people had what they needed. You had some sort of a beliefs-based organization, and you had a state. And it was really up to those two entities to ensure people had what they needed in order to survive. But it was quickly recognized that there was a gap in the middle. There were services that people still needed. And so the corporation or those entities that sold things to others, whether it was through barter and trade or other, in order to provide the services people needed, and they sold them at a profit. And that could allow them to move to the next step. And those entities in between, that corporation, that entity, started to make different decisions and investments in other areas. Sometimes in cooperation with the state, other times in cooperation with a belief organization. But what we've seen is as our populations have evolved, situations have changed, the corporation has become larger and larger, a grander influence, if you will, and now needs to partner even tighter in these public-private partnerships that were mentioned earlier. So again, I don't want to get too deep into the philosophical this early in this conversation, but what I'm most excited about to talk about here is this shift. Number one, in understanding what climate truly is. Number two, in recognizing that we are at a much more hopeful point because we now understand that we do not have to make choices between adaptation and mitigation, between survival and prosperity. And that we can, as entities, whether you are a corporation, whether you are a not-for-profit, an educational institution, or other, we can work together through public-private partnerships to build tremendous things together. And I think we're seeing that. So I'll stop there and hand it back.
Nelson, thank you very much. I really appreciate your way of approaching those very big questions that are, I mean, I'm Greek, I like philosophical, but I think these are very important building blocks on which we need to define or redefine, if you like, the way that on a policy and business and society level we will be addressing climate change, and we will be making something of a part of the progress of human species on the earth, actually, rather than a suffering and doomsday discussion. I will now turn to Gary before we come back with more questions. Gary has actually created the WaterEquity institution, and I think that's a very important point to start looking into the climate change and the need to mitigate and adapt, because water will be one of the key issues related to climate change. So if you would like to tell us about your point of view of how would relate discussion to water to climate change.
Yeah, and I really appreciate kind of the mix between kind of the philosophical and the macro and kind of what we can bring into kind of the way to take action today and pragmatism of this. Because right now what we see is that everyone in the world is affected by climate change, but obviously not everyone is affected equally. And from my perspective, and I would like to try to bring the perspective of the poor into the room today too, it's the poor that are going to suffer the most, that are already suffering the most. When we talk about water stress, water scarcity, all of these issues, we have to realize that right now there's already 2.1 billion people who have water scarcity, water stress in their lives. These are people who wake up today who don't necessarily know where their water is going to come from that day, how much they're going to have to pay for it, how far they're going to have to walk for it. And if we look at helping adapt to climate change, those are the ones that, and we have made great gains in reducing poverty and getting people water, but we also have the huge risk that that number of 2.1 billion can actually grow over the next few years. And we have SDG number 6 as our guidepost to try to make sure everybody in the world gets access to water and sanitation. And so we already have people who are today being impacted. You know, when you have the sea levels rising, you have saltwater intrusion into people's wells, and these are people living in poverty. It's like once they have saline water, what are they going to do? They don't have the resources to be able to mitigate or to adapt to that. And so what we're saying is that we want to look at the poor as a market, and how can we help them get access to the capital that they need. And the thing right now is that the poor are already paying between $200 and $300 billion every year in these coping costs. They're paying in terms of the hours that they spent walking each day because they're not working and earning a living. They're paying in terms of water vendors in urban slums where they pay huge amounts for water services, for water in these jerry cans, and they're paying in terms of their health. And so what we see is the upside of this is that the poor aren't just a group waiting for charity, but they are a group who is a market, and we want to help empower them to tap into their power as customers and as citizens. And so why do we need to do this? There's really 3 aspects of this. One is that there's not currently nearly enough money being invested in meeting SDG number 6. So it would take about $100 billion a year between now and 2030 in order to be able to meet the goal of water and sanitation for all. Right now, there's only about $14 billion being invested in terms of development assistance, philanthropy, and charity, and so on. So there's this huge gap that exists there. And we also see that there is a market there. We see that people are willing and able to pay for these services. What we've done with our initiative is help people get access to small loans, for instance. So I'll give you one example of a woman I met in the Philippines. Her name was Linariza, and she did not have enough money to pay for a connection fee to the municipal water system. It would take about $200. Yet she was paying $60 every month to buy water from these water vendors who would sell it in her slum. And so she had a couple of bucks every day, but she didn't have the $200. So what we helped her do was get access to a small loan through one of our microfinance partners. And so now she has reduced her monthly water bill to $5 a month. Now she has to pay off her loan. That'll take about $20 a month for the next year. But she now is going to be able to have access to water and sanitation. And you can see the economics and the finance in her family, why it makes sense. And so this market, these $200 to $300 billion in coping costs, just need to be redirected. So there's not enough money in the system right now. There's this market there of more than 2 billion people. And the third piece is what we've done with WaterEquity, and that is to create an investable solution. So we have now created 2 different funds. The first fund was $11 million, and it was targeted to India. We raised capital from investors in the US, and then we've invested that in microfinance institutions who can then deliver these small loans at the household level so people can get access to the water and sanitation that they need. Historically, those loans have paid back at more than 97%. So these are bankable loans. And so the next fund that we've created, the first fund targeted India and microfinance. Now we are raising a $50 million fund, and we've already received $40 million in commitments from the likes of Bank of America, OPIC, the Hilton Foundation, Skoll Foundation, Niagara Bottling, and others. And so what we have done is create this $50 million fund that will provide a financial return to investors, a targeted rate of 3.5%, while it's also going to reach 4.6 million people with access to water and sanitation. And so to bring this back again to climate change, the fact is that there are going to be more and more people who are subject to water scarcity and all types of water issues as the climate changes. And if we can put them in a position from the bottom up to get access to the capital that they need to help solve these solutions, it's going to take more pressure off of all of us to invest in these things from the top down. So that's what we're doing with WaterEquity. And again, like I say, it's actionable today. I mean, that's one of the reasons I'm here, is because we know investors are here. We have a fund that's ready to go to have this type of impact today.
Right. Thank you so much, Gary. I think that the examples that you gave us on the ground, actually, on how things can happen by giving a little bit of a push or a support, or just laying the conditions there for the people to be part of the solution, is very important. I was thinking while I heard all of you, actually, that in my time in politics, I learned one thing, that is that a politician will never ask a question if he or she doesn't know the answer. And it's very true. I mean, I've seen it every time and time again. But that actually is a human reaction to what we would call the risk aversion. And it's exactly the same thing that happens with capital. I mean, capital will not look to go and invest itself in a place where risk is very high. And I think that what you brought up, all of you, is very important, because, as I said in my opening remarks, we need to find a way to create inspiration for business development around addressing climate change. We need to find a way to, as you were saying, I think, Vijay, we need to simplify policy rather than making it more complicated, because complicated policy actually creates more risk. I mean, an investor will definitely be a little bit scared off by a very complicated policy. And just to come back to what you were saying, as I mentioned, there was this discussion at the European Union to discuss about how we can go towards more sustainable financing, sustainable investment, and so on. One title I read about that was green tape, like red tape. So if you want to create more conditions and rules and regulations and all that that will make investment even more complicated, while you're trying to explain how the system works, you're actually doing the inverse of what you would like to be doing. And I think that this will be a very important thing also to allow the policymakers, and that's why I started from that, to understand that developing the right policies that will create the mitigation of risk that you, Julia, mentioned is very important. So I would like to start actually from Saadia about this, trying to turn towards sustainable investment and sustainable and governance investment, ESG, as we call it. What is the way that we can actually try to engulf all of this uncertainty that exists around climate change and turn it into the appropriate policies that will lead into more investment in
I think it's interesting what you were saying about risk and investors, because I fundamentally believe that investors are in the business of buying risk. Mm-hmm. That is what they do across the board. But what you need to do is you need to understand that risk, and you need to package that risk in a way where investors know what they're getting and they can react accordingly. And that's where we haven't quite cracked it when it comes to climate yet. We're getting there, but that requires a lot more data coming in. There's a lot of research that has done, and that's slowly trying to get it integrated into these products and markets. So I do think that the investors would engage. They are engaging. You just have to understand what that risk actually is. On the policy side also, I mean, there's so much that's been said about, the policy environment here in the US and whether it's not friendly or not friendly enough or what needs to happen. US pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement. That hasn't stopped so much of the activity that's been going on at the municipal level and at the state level as well, and across corporations. So yes, we can all wait for the perfect policy environment to say now it's in place and everybody's interests are aligned and let's move forward. Or you can take the pockets where there is momentum building and go with that. And we see that happening across the world. I think the one word of caution around all of this is that we don't get lost in a world of pilots, which happens a lot when it comes to things that lie at the intersection of the private and the public and civil society and philanthropy, because we're all trying to come up with the solution, we're all trying to come up with the answer. But in this particular case, I think what we need to do is look at how the capital markets operate, and within those parameters say, how do we introduce things that actually would work, not as a small pilot, but on the same level as the markets work.
Right. Thank you very much. Julia, would you like to comment on that, seen from the side of the World Bank? Because you deal very much with the policymakers and you actually help the countries develop the policies that are necessary so that the risk will be averted in a way so that capital can flow in. And frankly, I mean, if we need to mobilize those 12.7 trillion for addressing climate change and the SDGs, we need to find the ways to get the private sector to come in.
Right. So, I mean, the easiest sector is energy, right? Where there are these very, very large investments, and where in developing countries, the ability of the state, which usually owns the companies, to actually pay for a private investment is questionable. So we can come in with financial products that actually guarantee that if the government doesn't pay, then we will pay. So that works kind of across the board and in lots and lots of countries. That's the kind of simple and straightforward version. It's not at all simple to do, let's not be clear, but it's the most conceptually straightforward thing to do, because the returns are in money, in actual cash, and they're also with a limited number of actors. One of the problems that we have in the other sectors is you've got very large numbers of actors. So there's lots and lots of smallholders doing different kinds of products that I'm sure Nestlé would love to have, the cocoa, the palm oil, the shea butter, all those cool things. But there are lots and lots of small actors, and it becomes harder, and that's why people like Vijay are around to try and marry those two things. But I'd like to give one example of Ethiopia. So, the famine in Ethiopia in the 1980s was in this area of Ethiopia, Tigray, which was very, very barren. And then the war between Ethiopia and Eritrea also. And for reasons that were not related to private investment, we were asked to help them invest in the landscape there, amongst other things. And so for 10 years, we basically paid very, very poor people to put little boulders covered in gabions, they're called. We've got boulders covered in wire mesh to basically slow down water, to stop them grazing up on hillsides and have them pen their goats and give them fodder. Really, really simple things that was done largely as a social protection mechanism. But we found, and other things like that, right, protecting the sides of streams. And in very short time, the river comes back, the hillsides become stable, the crops get fertilized. And over 10 years, we've seen the farmers, the households, invest in their land, which they never needed to do before because it might have got washed away at any time, right? And now we're seeing this flourishing of private investment. First of all, local private investment, the teff, and that they make the bread from, and the honey. I mean, the landless people. We invested in beehives for the landless people, and then they make the drink out of honey. So, local private investment flourishing. That's all very cute. But now, who are those people who make that coffee? Nespresso. Nespresso are now investing in them, in those farmers. So, as I said, we didn't do that for that reason. But it's turned out that we could have done it. And if we had done it for that reason, it might have gone a bit faster. We might have got IFC or Nestlé or somebody to come in and start making those deals earlier. So what we're trying to do now in these other areas is work where we work with the government, with the poorest people, it's landless people, women, uneducated people, everything, and try and package those things to bulk them up and then get the private investment in there quicker. Because, like you said, you're going to need a larger diversity of sources because, the droughts and the floods are more unpredictable. And the more we can help expand that thing, we think it's better.
Fantastic. Thank you for saying that and the actual example from Ethiopia, because the famine and food issue is and will be a very important one. I will turn to this side. I don't know why we have divided the ladies from the gentlemen, but anyway. So I will turn to this side, but just by saying one thing, the predictions of the United Nations is that by 2050 we'll have around 9 billion people on the planet, and that will need an increase of about 60% of the food that we're producing if we can address the actual problem of feeding all these people. At the same time, what is happening is that currently a third of the food that is produced globally is wasted. It doesn't reach the mouths that it needs to feed. Now, add to this another thing that, Gary, correct me if I'm wrong, but about 80% of water resources globally are spent on actually growing food. So if you multiply the 80% by the 30 almost percent of the food that is wasted, that means that about 25% of all the fresh water that is available on the planet is just wasted for food that will never do reach. And along the example that Julia said, I will turn to this side and ask any of you that want to take the floor right now. As you said, you don't plan the policies because you want eventually to get an espresso people or anybody else to come and do the big investment, but you need to find ways to attract the serious investment that might be serious not in the sense of size, but it could be serious in the sense of mobilizing a lot of people for small-scale investment like the one you said, Gary, or serious in the sense that Nestlé would start a new line of investment along the better management of water resources or empowering people, or from your experience, how we can actually address these big questions from factoring in all these issues. So if anybody would like to take the floor, Nelson, you're ready.
I feel compelled just because Nespresso has come up so many times and it is a Nestlé product. But a couple of items, and I think you touched on so many points there, but I want to make sure everybody else gets a chance as well. Policy, there's a really brilliant Canadian, his name is Chris Henderson, and he once said to me, remember that policy is a tool for deciding who gets what. And I thought that that was a really interesting way of framing up what policy and regulation was really all about. It's about making choices. One of the things as a corporation, you know, I've worked for several corporations now, but at Nestlé that we've recognized is that it's not necessarily about the regulation or about the policy. It's about the purpose. It's about the impact that we are after. So let me give you a specific example. We don't necessarily look to say, what is the policy in this region which is going to ensure and empower us that we are going to get the return on invested capital that's necessary. If we have a supply chain issue, and I'll speak specifically to water because it's where I spend most of my days, we in many cases are looking for additional spring water sources because consumers are demanding spring water for us to deliver it to them. And it's very difficult to find a sustainable spring water source, even as regions as blessed as North America. But in order to do it and to do it properly, it's not necessarily a political or a regulatory rationale that helps us. First, we're looking for a sustainable spring. Second, we're looking for a community that is looking for an entity that wants to help them develop their own resource. Because I think some of the things that we get confused about is, will the government allow it? Will policy de-risk this for us? But really, I think sometimes you go past that portion of de-risking and you're just looking for, how are you going to ensure that you can continue to operate your business in a sustainable manner? And you have to make sure that you understand what the local context is, which is why the whole discussion around context-based water targets and sustainability targets has become such a hot topic. So what we do is we identify common and mutual challenges and opportunities that exist. So both what we call value at risk, but also opportunity at risk within some of these particular basins. And we have discussions with those local communities to try to figure out where we have common challenges, either common value at risk or common opportunities at risk that we can solve together in a mutually beneficial way. We call that collective action. It is not a new term. It is known very well. If you read anything by the Alliance for Water Stewardship or any of the work that's come out of the California Water Action Collaborative, there's a lot of exceptional work that has been done this way. As a matter of fact, a lot of the work, I think we would probably characterize a lot of the work Gary's group does is collective action. It's identifying within a particular community the challenge that they're having, identifying the resources that you're having, the challenge you have, and how do you put those things together so you can mutually attack and solve that problem. And I put that above, at this point, the regulatory risk. As a matter of fact, in our framework, in which we have 22 questions that we ask, regulatory risk is actually, I think it's in the bottom third quite frankly, in our scoring methodology, simply because regulatory risk is not as substantial as it used to be. Not because government isn't as aggressive as ever, but in fact because the other elements of building a strong partnership are just that much more important.
That's very interesting, very, very interesting. Gary?
Well, and I think, you know, one of the themes here is like looking for unexpected solutions and turning things around in our minds and looking for how to solve the problem without expecting that, you know, the policies or the system around us is going to change. That's kind of a fool's errand. It's like only if, you know, this were that, right? And coming at this from the perspective of doing this for decades, before we launched WaterEquity, we had water.org, and it was a philanthropic approach. And it's just like, we knew that there was never going to be enough charity in the world to reach everybody with safe water and sanitation. The numbers just don't add up. And so we could continue to like harp on that and say, okay, let's just drive so much more money into this from governments, whatever, or we can look at the situation at hand, and that's that we knew poor people were a market, and we knew that we could create a fund and test this, and we did that. We've reached 10 million people with access to loans now who didn't have to be reached through charity, right? And they're repaying these loans higher than people in this country repay their car loans. And so it's like looking at the system differently and saying, you know, it's not tenable that we would assume that all the poor in the world are equally poor and too poor to pay for these services. It's ridiculous to assume that, but that's the way philanthropy works. There's hundreds of water charities, and they're all coming at it from the perspective of we need more donations, we need to drill more wells and give away more water. And so the perspective is like, how do you tap into the market as it exists rather than waiting for the market to change? And that's where we've demonstrated with WaterEquity, there is a way for people to invest, to get a financial return here, translate that into water and sanitation solutions that reduce people's water expenditures by an order of magnitude sometime and go forward. And so I think that's the kind of thing we have to look for, you know, where can we make 1 + 1 = 3? How do we make the poor and the solutions come from the bottom up to match the solutions that we provide from the top down?
Thank you, Gary. We will have like 10 minutes to wrap this up, so now's the time to lift your hand up if you have a question, while I'm giving the floor also to Vijay if you want to comment on what was said before while we're waiting for those hands to come up.
Sure, and please interrupt me and ask questions as we go through this. You know, I have no problem with policy, and I agree with the sentiment of my fellow panelists. I get where
you have a problem with microphones.
Yeah,
policy you don't.
Where I think where we do take a little bit of issue is when the policies are inconsistent, they contradict each other, they're outdated, because what that does is it stifles our ability to operate and innovate. And there's many examples of that in this sector. And look, it can be a good thing because they set the guardrails and they give us a chance to make decisions. And I completely agree with Saadia. I mean, look, we're in the business of taking risk as long as the reward outweighs that risk. And so we've made a series of decisions and we've made investments and we're participating in markets that perhaps others don't like, but we love them because we see a very attractive economic return there. And so there's a confluence of all these factors, and totally agree, right? I mean, this is a deeply intertwined nexus of social issues and political issues, philosophical issues, economic issues. But there's some real answers here. I think as long as I'll just keep going back to the same themes, we just need a simplicity and clarity of kind of policy purpose. You know, put the United States aside, I was recently in France, and you know, and Paris has this laudable objective of reducing its air emissions and improving its air quality, but they did this in a really bizarre way of kind of restricting how cars can drive around, and as a result they are idling more, which means they're emitting more. And so this is a, you know, there's many examples in the US as well and all around the world, right? These are examples of how the policy that has a good goal kind of goes in the other direction. And has an odd unintended consequence. And for a private participant, as a private sector player, we have to immediately respond, right, to some of those changes. And that's where I see the risk and the reward. But
I think we have a question there.
Yeah. Microphone's on?
Yep.
I think there's probably at least 8 people in the room who are comfortable with abstraction. And then there's the rest of us who are looking for ideas along the lines of the title, Investing in Climate Change. So taking it from the general to the specific, some panelists talked about their excitement and interest in new vehicles. Other panelists talked about their excitement and interest in specific verticals such as water. I'd like to hear, as we use up the rest of the time, quickly going down the line, where would they invest? I say this from the perspective of running both a family office and a private equity organization with 100 to 150 million now in an impact fund, and we're strongly considering it. So I consider the 5 of you valuable resources to fill me with ideas to take to the investment allocation committee. So, and you may reasonably promote things that you own. If you would,
6% of the fund?
you may reasonably, no, we're going to throw it all at you, but you may reasonably promote things that you own in order for us to raise your price.
Guys, here's your chance. Gary, would you like to start?
Well, I said, we have a $50 million fund right now. We have 40 million towards that to get it closed. Basically, our fund, for every $1 million that's invested by a accredited investor over the life of the fund, 100,000 people get access to water or sanitation. You get a distribution of 3.5% each year along the way, and at the end you get your principal back. So I think that's the fund that we have that's like ready to go. And we've already done one fund, and we've already started providing distributions to investors in that fund, so we do have a track record. And I think if you need any more sex appeal, then Matt Damon was the first investor. He put the first $1 million into our fund. He's the co-founder of WaterEquity with me. And he believed in it and put his money in. And then, like I said, Bank of America, others have followed. And we actually also in that fund have a 10% first loss guarantee that underpins the investment overall that we've been able to raise to ensure those first losses that might occur, both in terms of the principal and the returns. Nelson.
Sure. So, first I would recommend a solid old school blue chip like Nestlé. You might want to check it out. But in all seriousness, I know we talked about water earlier, but to get a little bit more specific, because I don't want to sit up here and pan for other companies, but I would be looking at companies that are deeply integrated with regard to infrastructure, especially what we call at this point the Internet of Water. I think data and analytics when it comes to water quality and water quantity is going to be one of the most important areas of investment. There is a tremendous amount out of Israel. I would encourage you to look at it. Is quite frankly, every year they have one of the most impressive water technology conferences. I thought I saw Nati here, actually. There he is, right there. Here's a gentleman you should speak to from Netafim, who can talk to you about specific types of technology for irrigation. There's just so much, and I'm not just talking about water efficiency. Water efficiency is something that slows down the challenge we have. We need to be looking at those types of technologies that in fact encourage reuse, recycling, quality, and accessibility. Those to me are the most important areas to be investing in when it comes to climate, because adaptation is absolutely the most important conversation we should be having if we're thinking about the next 200 years.
And I will ask the rest of the panel to really give your best punchline because you have a stake at all those millions, so you have 1.5 minutes each to do it.
Yeah, I'll be quick. We're not going to answer your question. No, we're an environmental services business. We're doubling in size every 2 years. I think we're incredibly bullish about our ability to continue doing that. Capital is a key part of it, right? So how we raise capital, how we deploy it. And as we grow at the rate we're growing at, we certainly are going to be tapping into the capital markets more in the very near future in different ways. And so if you're interested, would love to talk to you more about it in a much more private setting.
All right. Rockefeller Foundation.
So my lawyer would be very, very uncomfortable if I sat up here and told you what to invest in. So I'm going to give you 3 examples that, depending on your risk profile, may or may not be attractive to you. I mentioned environmental impact bonds earlier today. DC Water issued the very first one last year. It was to drive investment capital towards green infrastructure. It is a municipal bond with a pay-for-performance component to it. There are other municipalities, including Atlanta, that are in the process of structuring similar products. So if you want to go municipal finance route, that could be one. Land Degradation Neutrality Fund is another example. It is a private equity fund that would invest in land rehabilitation. every year you have land the equivalent of UK that gets degraded and cannot be used anymore. The economics of it, the fund managers, Mirova is the fund manager, they've said it's probably comparable to what you would get from a sustainable infrastructure fund. But if you want to go down that route, then that's an option. And then the third one, I would say, which has been on the market for longer term, so if you want to go with something tried and tested but still feel you're having an impact, is renewable energy investment trust. So listed securities, it's listed on the London Stock Exchange. It already has more than $1 billion that's invested in it. So if you want to go down a route of renewable, more a proven market and something that's been around for a while, I would have you take a look at Greencoat UK Wind.
Thank you, Julia.
So there's a reason that they had us sit next to each other. I was going to say renewable energy or any form of energy in the developing world has a hugely high return. I was going to say land degradation, because all that food for 9 billion people there's only one place it can come from, which is the currently degraded lands, and that has to have a higher value. At the moment it has a very low value. And all the climate smart agriculture, especially the long crops, so not the annuals but the trees, the things that just take longer because it's harder. So with some risk mitigation measures, the returns on that can be released.
Right, thank you very much. Just as a final point, I'd like to just mention that we are from our SDG Governance Center trying to look into what somebody said before, how the data analytics can become a very strong tool for allowing to actually take decisions like the one you, or ideas like the one you mentioned. And we will be trying to develop that along with data analytics and artificial intelligence so that we can incorporate all this complexity of things in a way, and through that process be sure that we'll be reaching out to all of you guys, or not just you. With this, I would like to thank you all for being here. We have now to conclude. I would like you to give a very big hand to all of the panelists and to yourselves for being here, such a great audience, and see you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.